Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a deep look into important sources, pull out the key insights, and really get you up to speed fast.
That's the goal.
And today, wow, we're diving into a huge chunk of history. I mean, truly foundational for China. We're talking about the Zhou Dynasty.
Yeah, an epic stretch of time.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. This wasn't just any dynasty. It was China's longest-lasting one. We're talking nearly 800 years. Think about that.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
For centuries, the Zhou were basically laying the groundwork, shaping politics, society, even the deep philosophical ideas that China would build on later. It influenced pretty much everything that came after.
And for this deep dive, our main guide is this comprehensive encyclopedic review. It's titled Zhou Hanadana ve Xinde Feudal System, Modo 2036, Kapsamlu Encyclopedic Ensalama.
Okay, quite a mouthful, but comprehensive sounds good.
Exactly. So our mission really is to explore how the Zhou set up this this unique feudal system. We want to look at how it evolved, from being really strong and cohesive at first to eventually fragmenting quite profoundly.
Right.
And then, crucially, understand the philosophical stuff, the cultural contributions that came out of that whole period, things that still echo today.
So the goal is for you listening to really get a handle on its legacy, how it shaped Chinese government, society, the whole picture.
Precisely. What's fascinating here, and this is what we really want to unpack for you, is how one dynasty could cover such a massive arc of change, evolution, transformation. It really set the stage for so much later history. We want to give you that shortcut, basically, to being really well-informed on this absolute pivotal era.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's jump right in. How did this massive dynasty even start? It involves overthrowing the previous guys, the Shang, right? And then figuring out how to make their own rules stick.
Yeah, it's a dramatic beginning. So picture this. It's around the 11th century BCE, the Shang dynasty. They'd been the big power for, centuries.
The established order.
Exactly. But they were starting to really struggle. You can imagine, like this grand old building, suddenly showing some serious cracks.
What was going wrong?
Well, the sources point to deep internal turmoil. Corruption, maybe, within the leadership. Just a general sense that their central grip was loosening. It created this power vacuum. A real opportunity for someone else.
Enter the Zhou.
Into the Zhou. Now, they weren't newcomers, but they were on the edges of Shang territory. Originally, maybe semi-nomadic, but with strong farming roots. And they'd been watching the Shang falter and very carefully, meticulously organizing themselves, building up their social cohesion, their military strength.
So it wasn't just a random rebellion, it was planned.
Oh, definitely strategic. They were building alliances with other groups who weren't happy with the Shang either. It was a calculated rise, patient. Not a sudden explosion, more like a slow burn that built up pressure. And this all leads to this really pivotal moment around 1046 BCE, the Battle of Muay.
Ooh, yay. Got it.
This wasn't just some border skirmish. This was the decisive battle. The Zhou forces, led by King Wu, just completely crushed the main Shang army. They captured the Shang capital and boom, effectively took control of China. It was a huge military win.
Yeah.
Shows their organization, their strategy.
But, winning the battle is one thing. Holding on to power, especially after kicking out a dynasty that had been around forever and claimed divine backing, that's another story. Military force isn't always enough.
Yeah, absolutely not. They needed something more solid, something ideological. They needed legitimacy.
Right.
And this leads us to, honestly, one of the most brilliant, most enduring political concepts ever to come out of China, maybe anywhere, the Mandate of Heaven. Tianming. Okay, I've heard of this. This is big.
It is huge. It wasn't just, a catchy phrase. It was the absolute cornerstone of Zhou legitimacy, a truly revolutionary idea that would shape Chinese government for thousands of years.
So what is it exactly? How did it work? Well, Tianming basically said that the king's right to rule and the Zhou kings called themselves Son of Heaven. Tianzi wasn't just from winning battles. It was a direct divine decree. From heaven itself.
Okay, so divine right, basically.
Sort of. But here's the genius part, the catch. This mandate, this divine right, it was not unconditional.
Ah, okay, that is different.
Totally different. And this is the crucial bit. The Zhou believed, or at least promoted the belief, that the king could lose this right. He could lose the mandate if he became unjust, if he was corrupt, if he governed poorly.
How would you know if he'd lost it?
Well, things going wrong could be seen as signs. Frequent natural disasters, floods, droughts, widespread famine, popular uprisings. All these could be read as heaven basically saying, nope, you're done, we're withdrawing our support.
Here's where it gets really interesting then. Tianmin wasn't just about grabbing power. It was about accountability. It was a justification, sure, but also a warning.
Exactly. It did two things brilliantly. First, it let the Zhou look back and say, hey, we overthrew the Shang because they lost the mandate. They were corrupt, immoral, heaven wasn't happy. It justified their conquest.
Okay, clever.
But second, and maybe even more importantly, it put this immense constant pressure on the Zhou kings themselves. They had to govern well, they had to be virtuous, look after the people, maintain harmony. If they failed, guess what? Someone else could come along and claim they'd lost the mandate.
So it's like a built-in check on power, a moral requirement for rule.
Precisely. It's an ethical dimension to governance that was pretty groundbreaking. It meant the ruler wasn't just the strongest guy around. They were accountable to a higher moral standard, accountable to heaven, and through that, kind of accountable to the people's well-being, too. This idea echoes down through Chinese history, explaining why dynasties rise and fall.
That really did redefine things. Okay, so they've won the war, they've got this powerful idea, Tianming, justifying their rule, but now they've got this massive territory to actually govern. How do you do that back then, without modern communication, roads, all that?
That was the huge practical problem. This wasn't a tiny kingdom anymore. The Zhou controlled a much, much bigger area than the Shang had, a direct, centralized bureaucracy like we might think of. It just wasn't feasible. The distances were too great, the regions too diverse.
So sending out governors from the capital to run every little town wasn't going to work.
Not effectively, no. They needed a different approach.
And their solution was?
This is where they developed their really innovative system, a decentralized feudal structure. It's often called the Zhou feudal system.
Feudalism. Okay, like medieval Europe, castles and knights.
Well, yes and no. There are similarities, but the Zhou version had its own distinct flavor. The basic idea was this. The Zhou king couldn't rule everywhere directly, so he granted large chunks of territory fiefdoms, basically to people he trusted.
Who did he give land to?
Primarily his close relatives. Brothers, uncles, cousins, also his most loyal generals and allies, the guys who helped him win the throne, and maybe some descendants of ancient sages or heroes to bolster legitimacy.
Okay, so he's parceling out the empire to his family and friends, essentially.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And these people became the feudal lords within their own territory, their fiefdom. They had a lot of power. Real, semi-independent rule.
What could they do?
They could collect taxes from the people living there. They could raise their own local armies for defense, but also to contribute to the king's campaigns when called upon. They could even set up their own local courts and administer justice. It effectively pushed the day-to-day administration down to a local level.
That sounds like you're giving away a lot of power, though. If these lords have their own armies and taxes, aren't you just setting up future rivals? Sounds a bit risky.
It's a really important question, and yes, that risk was always there, and it eventually did cause problems down the line. But initially, especially in the Western Zhou period, it worked pretty well.
Why? What held it together?
A few key things. First, the king was still the son of heaven, Tianzi. His religious and legal authority, at least symbolically, remained supreme. All the major rituals, the connection to heaven, centered on him. That gave him a unique kind of legitimacy.
The ideological glue.
Yes. And second, and this is maybe a key difference from some later European feudalisms,
Yes.
the Zhou system relied heavily on kinship ties. These weren't just random lords, they were mostly family, brothers, uncles, cousins, ruling different regions, all theoretically loyal to the head of the family, the king. Loyalty was supposed to flow along bloodlines.
So it's like a giant extended family running the country.
That's a pretty good way to think about it, especially early on. It created this interconnected network. It was practical for the time and allowed them to control a vast area without needing a huge central bureaucracy, which they just couldn't have supported back then. It leveraged personal loyalty and family duty.
Okay, that makes sense. And the system created a very specific social structure, right? A hierarchy.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very strict hierarchy, a real pyramid of power and status.
So walk us through it, top to bottom.
Right at the very top, you've got the king, Tianzi, son of heaven, holds the mandate. He's the ultimate source of authority, theoretically.
Okay, below him.
Below the king are the big players, the main feudal lords. The source calls them feudal beys, essentially the major vassals. These are the guys who got the big land grants, often that, as we said, the king's closest relatives or most powerful allies. They held titles like duke, marquis, earl, things like that.
The upper crust.
Definitely. Then below them, you had layers of lesser nobles, knights, officials, warriors.
Yeah.
They were aristocracy, basically, of various ranks. These guys served under the major feudal lords that hold smaller estates, maybe, or serve in the lord's court or army. They owed loyalty and service to their lord, who then owed it upwards to the king.
The chain of command,
The
basically.
chain of fealty, exactly. And then, at the very bottom of this whole pyramid,
The vast majority of people, I'm guessing.
the vast majority, the peasants, the farmers, sometimes referred to as serfs, they worked the land, they paid the taxes, usually in the grain or labor. They formed the economic engine for the whole system. And they were also the ones conscripted into the armies when needed.
So your place in this pyramid pretty much decided your whole life.
To a huge extent, yes. Social mobility was very limited. Your birth largely determined your status, your rights, your obligations, your access to power and resources. It was very clearly defined and very unequal structure. But it was the framework that allowed the Zhou to govern, at least initially, for quite a long time.
This system really hit its stride during the Western Zhou period, right? That's roughly 1046 to 771 BCE. This was the time when it was working as intended.
Generally speaking, yes. The Western Zhou is often seen as the kind of the golden age of this feudal system as a state model. The king's strategy of extending authority by granting land seemed effective. Well, by placing trusted relatives and allies in charge of key regions, he created a network that could, in theory, administer these diverse areas effectively. It was a way to project power outwards from the center. And during this period, the Zhou kingdom seemed to have been quite strong, both militarily and economically.
And the lords generally played ball. They listened to the king.
For the most part, it seems so. The sources suggest a good degree of cohesion. Most feudal lords largely followed the king's commands, paid tribute, sent troops when required. The system maintained a level of obedience to the central authority.
How was the government actually run day to day?
Well, the internal structure involved sharing management among members of the dynasty itself, reinforcing that family-based hierarchy we talked about. Key posts were often held by royals. And the king wasn't just stuck in the capital. There were royal tours, grand assemblies where lords would gather, renew their oaths, receive rewards or instructions. This helped reinforce the king's supremacy, both symbolic and practical. It was a time of relative stability and prosperity under this model.
And that prosperity, you mentioned it was rooted in the land, in agriculture.
Absolutely fundamental. This was an agrarian society through and through. Agriculture was the engine of the economy.
So the lords got rich from their land.
Pretty much. Their economic power came directly from taxing the peasants who worked their fields. Collecting tribute, mostly in grain, was how they funded their households, their courts, their armies. Control over agricultural output was the basis of their wealth.
Was it just basic farming, or did things improve?
No, it wasn't static. This period actually saw significant improvements in farming tech. Better irrigation systems were developed, which meant more land could be cultivated, new farming methods, maybe early forms of crop rotation, and critically, the use of iron tools started to become more common. Iron plows, for instance, could work tougher soils than bronze or wooden ones.
Ah, iron. That's a big deal.
Huge deal. It boosted productivity, more food could support a larger population, a more complex society. And while farming was king, we do see the beginnings of other things. Specialized crafts, those amazing Zhou bronzes, jade carving, and also some expansion of trade networks. But yeah, the economy's heart was definitely agriculture.
What about the social side? You mentioned kinship being key. How did that play out in everyday life?
It was absolutely central. The family unit was the foundation of everything in Western Zhou society. And we're not talking small nuclear families like today. Think big, multi-generational clans. Your lineage, your place within that large family structure, defined who you were.
And ancestor worship was tied into this.
Deeply. Honoring your ancestors wasn't just a religious thing. It was woven into daily life, into state ceremonies. It reinforced family ties, clan identity, social order. The ancestors were seen as active participants, needing to be appeased and consulted. It gave legitimacy to the heads of families, the patriarchs, and ultimately to the king as this sort of ultimate patriarch of the realm.
So the power of the lords wasn't just land and armies, it was also tied to their family name, their lineage.
Inextricably linked. Your status often depended on how closely related you were to the royal Zhou house or other powerful founding figures. Kinship was the bedrock for political alliances, too. You made alliances often through marriage, strengthening family ties between ruling houses. Loyalty flowed along these bloodlines. It created this deeply interconnected society where family was paramount, shaping both politics and social life. It was really the glue holding the Western Zhou together.
Okay, so Western Zoo sounds relatively stable, prosperous, held together by this blend of feudal structure and strong kinship ties, all under the symbolic umbrella of the Mandate of Heaven. But then things change. We move into the Eastern Zoo period, starting around 770 BCE. What happened?
Yeah, 771 BCE is the critical turning point. This marks the end of the Western Zoo and the start of the Eastern Zoo, which lasts all the way down to 256 BCE. And the trigger event is a forced move of the capital.
They had to pack up and leave. Why?
It wasn't a choice made from strength. The zoo were facing serious problems. There was internal conflict, fighting within the royal court itself. And crucially, they were under relentless attack from outside groups, nomadic tribes, particularly the Kwanrong and the Didi peoples from the north and west,
Go invasions.
pretty much. These attacks became so severe that the Zhou king was actually killed, and his successor, King Ping, along with the court, was forced to abandon the western capital, Haojing, near modern Shan, and flee eastwards to Luoyang.
Luoyang, okay, so they moved the whole center of power.
They did. And this move, while necessary for survival, was a massive blow to the dynasty's prestige and actual power. It signaled a fundamental weakening of central authority. They lost direct control over their original fertile western heartland. They became much more dependent on the eastern feudal lords for protection. It really ushered in an era of profound change and instability. The king's power started to seriously erode.
And this leads into the first part of the Eastern Zoo, the spring and autumn period, right? Roughly 770 to 481 BCE. The name itself sounds kind of poetic, but was it?
The name comes from a famous historical chronicle of the era, the Spring and Autumn Annals. But the reality, it was increasingly chaotic. That feudal system we described, the one based on loyalty to the Zhou king, it started to seriously unravel.
How so?
Those feudal lords, ruling their territories, they started acting much more independently. Hundreds of states, large and small, effectively began running their own affairs. They paid less and less attention to the Zhou king in Luoyang. He was still there, performing rituals, holding the title Son of Heaven, but his actual political clout, it was dwindling fast.
So the lords became the real power players.
Increasingly, yes. This period sees a definite power shift. Feudal lords built up their own strength, bigger armies, more efficient administration within their own states. They started forming alliances with each other, often against other lords. Diplomacy became incredibly complex, and crucially, warfare between these states became much more common and intense.
So the king is just a figurehead now.
Pretty much. He retained symbolic importance, religious authority. Lords might still invoke his name to justify their actions or ask him to formally approve titles they'd already grabbed. But in terms of real political or military power, he had very little left. He was often just a pawn in the games being played by the most powerful states.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Constant political maneuvering, warfare. Yet, you said earlier this was somehow a golden age for philosophy. That seems like such a paradox.
It really does, doesn't it? But it's true. Despite, or maybe because of, the political chaos, the breakdown of the old order, the uncertainty, this spring and autumn period, bleeding into the later warring states period, became the most incredibly fertile time for Chinese thought.
Why? What was the connection?
Well, think about it. The old certainties were gone. The Zhou system wasn't working anymore. Society was in flux, often violent flux. People were desperately searching for answers. How do we restore order? What's the right way for people to live together? What's the ideal form of government? This crisis forced people to think deeply, to question everything, and to propose radical new solutions.
And this is when figures like Confucius appear.
Exactly. Confucius lived right in the middle of this, around the 6th century BCE. His whole philosophy was essentially a response to the chaos he saw around him. He looked back to the early Zhou, maybe idealizing it a bit, and proposed a way to restore order based on ethics, morality, and proper social roles.
What were his core ideas?
He emphasized things like Ren benevolence, humaneness, Yi righteousness, ritual propriety, knowing your place and acting accordingly. He stressed the importance of education, self-cultivation, and virtuous leadership. He believed that if rulers set a good moral example, and if everyone fulfilled their social duties, ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, then harmony would naturally return. Justice, virtue in government, responsibility of the lords. That was his prescription.
So a moral solution to political chaos.
Primarily, yes. But he wasn't the only one thinking. This era saw the rise of what are often called the 100 schools of thought. Confucianism was hugely influential. But other major philosophical currents emerged too, offering very different answers.
Like Taoism and legalism.
Precisely. Taoism offered a completely different perspective, emphasizing harmony with nature, simplicity, letting things take their course, maybe even withdrawing from the messy world of politics.
Mm.
Legalism went in another direction, entirely arguing that morality was useless and only strict laws, harsh punishments, and absolute state power could create order.
Wow. So completely different blueprints for society emerging from the same troubled time.
Exactly. And the debates between these schools, the ideas they generated, profoundly shaped China's political, social, and ethical thought for the next 2,000 years plus. They were all wrestling with the legacy of the fragmenting Zhou world and trying to figure out what should come next.
And that fragmentation only got worse, didn't it? After the spring and autumn period comes the warring states period. Sounds even less fun.
Yeah, the name says it all. This period, roughly 475 to 221 BCE, was basically the spring and autumn period on steroids.
Yeah.
The conflict intensified, became even more brutal and large-scale.
What changed?
The number of players shrank dramatically. Through constant warfare and annexation, the hundreds of smaller states were swallowed up. By this time, you really only had 7 major states left standing, battling it out for ultimate supremacy.
The dominant 7. Who were they?
You had Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin. These were the big powers, the heavyweights.
And any pretense of respecting the Zhou king was gone by now?
Completely gone. The rulers of these powerful states openly called themselves kings. They acted as totally independent sovereigns. The Zhou king in Luoyang. He was irrelevant, ruling a tiny, powerless domain, eventually extinguished altogether by Qin. The old feudal structure had totally collapsed into anarchy.
And warfare became even more sophisticated, more deadly.
Absolutely. This is when we see the widespread adoption of iron weapons really taking hold, making armies far more lethal. Cavalry, mounted soldiers became much more common and crucial on the battlefield, offering speed and flexibility.
Tactics changed, too.
Big time. Military strategy became a high art. Thinkers like Sun Tzu, supposedly writing The Art of War around this time, were developing complex ideas about tactics, logistics, deception, espionage. Diplomacy was ruthless. Alliances shifted constantly. It was total war, a fight to the death between these massive, professionalized armies, each vying to be the one to finally conquer all the others and end the chaos. The old Zhou feudalism was dead. This was a new, much harsher reality.
Okay, let's zoom back in a bit from the constant warfare and look at the underlying fabric of Zhou society during these long centuries, especially focusing on land, labor, and law. You said land was the basis of power.
Absolutely central. In the Zhou feudal system, land wasn't just where you grew food, it was power. Political power, social status, economic wealth, it all flowed from control over land.
And the land grants the king gave out, they became permanent family possessions.
That's right. These territories, granted initially by the king, became hereditary holdings for the feudal lords' families, passed down from father to son, generation after generation.
What were the consequences of that?
Well, it meant that certain powerful families could establish, essentially, absolute dominion over vast tracts of land and the people on it. They became entrenched aristocracies. Over time, this naturally led to growing inequalities. Some families controlled huge, productive regions, becoming incredibly wealthy and influential. Others held smaller, less fertile lands. This disparity in landholding fueled the rivalries and power struggles, especially as the central Zhou authority weakened. The system, in a way, contained the seeds of its own fragmentation because power became so localized and hereditary.
And the people actually working this land, the peasants, what was their situation like?
They were the absolute backbone of the economy, but their status was low. They were the class responsible for farming, for producing the food and wealth that supported the entire aristocracy. They also paid taxes in grain, silk, or labor, and provided the manpower for the armies when their lords went to war.
Were they free or tied
No.
to the land?
Most peasants were largely in a serf-like status. They were tied to the land. They couldn't just pick up and leave to seek better opportunities elsewhere. They belonged to the estate, and their lives were fundamentally tied to the lord who controlled that land. They were the base of the economic pyramid, essential but largely unfree.
Yet, you mentioned earlier that agriculture did advance during this time.
Yes, that's an important point. Despite the peasants' subservient status, the Zhou era, particularly the Eastern Zhou with its competing states, saw significant economic growth and technological progress in agriculture. Iron tools, better irrigation, maybe new crops or techniques, these things did develop. But the benefits didn't necessarily trickle down much to the peasants themselves. Often, these improvements just allowed lords to extract more surplus, support larger armies, and fuel the ongoing conflicts. It was a contrasting development, technological progress alongside deep social hierarchy and exploitation.
So we have this rigid social ladder: king, lords, nobles, peasants. How did law fit into this? Was there a single legal code?
Not really in the modern sense. The hierarchy was very strict, as you say, with clear divisions and duties for each class. The legal system, though, wasn't a unified written code handed down from the top, especially not across the whole Zhou period. It was largely based on tradition, customary norms, and ritual propriety, the li that Confucius emphasized.
So local justice prevailed.
Mostly, yes. The feudal lords had the right to administer justice within their own territories. They held court, settled disputes, punished criminals according to local customs and their own judgment. This meant the law could be quite different from one state or fiefdom to another.
What about the king's legal role?
Symbolically, the king was the ultimate legal authority. He might get involved in major disputes between powerful lords or set precedents through his actions. But practically speaking, especially as time went on and his power faded, his ability to enforce laws directly across the vast decentralized realm was very limited. Justice was primarily local, dispensed by the lord who held the land.
Let's shift focus to the military side again. Armies were clearly crucial, especially as the Zhou period wore on. How were they actually put together under this feudal system?
Well, the core principle was decentralization. Each major feudal lord was responsible for raising and equipping his own army from within his territory. The king had his own royal guard, perhaps, but his main strength relied on calling upon the military forces sworn to him by his vassals, the lords.
Who served in these armies?
It was typically a mix. You had the peasants, the farmers, who formed the bulk of the infantry. They conscripted, basically drafted for campaigns when needed. Then you had a more professional warrior class, the Shi, who were a lesser nobility. They often served as officers, elite soldiers, or, crucially in the early period, as chariot warriors.
Chariots were important.
Hugely important, especially in Western Zhou and early spring and autumn. Chariot warfare was prestigious, associated with the aristocracy. Battles often involved formations of chariots acting as mobile fighting platforms.
And the size of a lord's army depended on how rich he was.
Directly linked. The economic power of a lord, the amount of land, population, and agricultural surplus he controlled, determined how large and well-equipped an army he could field and maintain. Richer states could afford more soldiers, better weapons, longer campaigns. This economic link became even more critical during the Warring States period, fueling an arms race.
Did the armies change much over time?
Oh, definitely. As we moved into the Warring States period, with its constant large-scale warfare, armies became much larger and more professionalized. States invested heavily in military training, discipline, and logistics. Infantry tactics became more sophisticated, and the reliance shifted somewhat from aristocratic chariots towards massed infantry and the growing importance of cavalry.
And the technology kept improving too. Iron weapons, you mentioned.
Yes, the Iron Age really transformed warfare. Iron swords, spearheads, arrowheads were simply tougher and more effective than bronze. They could also be produced more cheaply and in larger quantities, allowing for bigger armies to be equipped.
What about cavalry?
Cavalry became increasingly significant, especially after the Chinese states encountered nomadic peoples to the north who were skilled horsemen. Mounted archers and lancers offered speed and maneuverability that chariots couldn't always match, especially in rough terrain. They became key components of warring states' armies, enabling flanking attacks, scouting, and rapid pursuits.
So weapons and units evolved. Did strategy evolve too?
Immensely. This wasn't just about brute force. The Warring States period saw the rise of sophisticated military strategy and tactics. Commanders planned complex campaigns involving large armies. Siege warfare against fortified cities became common, and logistics supplying these huge forces was critical. This is the era that produced classic military texts like Sun Tzu's Art of War, reflecting a deep intellectual engagement with the principles of warfare, deception, and strategy.
It's clear the Zhou era was transformative politically and militarily. What about culture and religion? What were the core beliefs?
Religion was deeply woven into the fabric of Zhou's society. The two central pillars were ancestor worship and heaven worship, and they were closely connected.
We touched on ancestor worship with the family structure.
Exactly. Honoring your ancestors through rituals was vital. It maintained family ties, legitimized authority within the lineage, and was believed to ensure the ancestors' blessings and protection. These weren't just private family affairs. State ceremonies also heavily involved honoring the royal ancestors.
And heaven worship. That ties back to the mandate of heaven.
Precisely. Heaven, Tian, was seen as the supreme deity, the source of cosmic order and political legitimacy. The king, as the son of heaven, had the unique and crucial role of mediating between heaven and the human world. He performed the most important sacrifices to heaven, praying for good harvests, victory in war, and the overall well-being of the kingdom.
So the king was like a high priest, too.
Essentially, yes. His political and religious roles were inseparable. Performing these rituals correctly was vital for maintaining social order, demonstrating his virtue, and reaffirming that he held the mandate of heaven. If the rituals were neglected or performed improperly, it could be seen as a sign of disorder or the king losing heaven's favor.
Beyond religion, was this a time for arts and literature, too?
Oh, absolutely. Despite the turmoil of the later periods, the Zhou era saw significant developments. Poetry flourished. The most famous example is the Shaijing, the classic of poetry.
What's in that?
It's an amazing collection of around 300 poems dating from the Western Zhou down into the spring and autumn period. It includes court hymns used in rituals, folk songs about farming, love, daily life, even pieces that offer social or political criticism. It gives us an incredible glimpse into the minds and lives of people from that time.
What about visual arts?
Bronze work reached an incredible peak during the Zhou, especially the ritual bronze vessels. These weren't just functional, they were highly symbolic objects used in ceremonies for ancestors in heaven. They often feature intricate designs, animal motifs, and sometimes long inscriptions detailing historical events or honors granted by the king. They're masterpieces of metallurgy and artistry.
And writing itself developed.
Yes, the script inherited from the Shang continued to evolve and became more widespread. We see longer inscriptions on bronzes, and presumably writing on perishable materials like bamboo strips became more common, essential for administration, record-keeping, and of course transmitting those philosophical ideas we talked about.
Let's dive back into those philosophies, because they seem so central to the Zhou legacy, especially emerging from that Eastern Zhou chaos. Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, these weren't just abstract thoughts, were they? They were real attempts to fix a broken world.
Exactly right. You can't understand them without understanding the context. The breakdown of the Zhou order, the constant warfare, the search for stability. Each school offered a diagnosis of the problem and a prescription for the cure.
So Confucianism, we said, moral cultivation, ritual, good examples. How did Confucius think this would actually work in practice?
He believed that society functioned best when people understood and properly fulfilled their roles within a clear hierarchy, guided by ethical principles. So, rulers should be benevolent, Ren, and righteous, Yi, acting like fathers to their people. Officials should be educated, loyal, and morally upright. Everyone should practice filial piety, respect for parents and elders, as this was the foundation for loyalty to the state. He emphasized Li, the rituals and rules of proper conduct, believing they internalized moral values and created social harmony. If everyone focused on becoming a better person and fulfilling their duties according to Li, order would naturally emerge. It was about transforming society from the inside out through education and moral example.
Okay, a focus on human relationships and ethics. How did Taoism differ so much? Harmony with the Tao, simplicity. What did that mean practically?
Taoism, associated with figures like Laozi and Zhuangzi, looked at the Confucian focus on social rules and hierarchies and basically said, that's the problem, not the solution. They believed that true harmony came from aligning oneself with the Tao, the natural underlying way of the universe, which is effortless, spontaneous, and constantly changing.
So less government, less striving.
Very much so. Taoists advocated for Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, essentially, acting in accordance with nature, not forcing things. They valued simplicity, humility, and living naturally. Too many laws, too much ambition, too much differentiation between good and bad, these things, they argued, created conflict and suffering. The ideal Taoist ruler might govern so subtly that the people barely know they exist. It's about finding peace by letting go of artificial constructs and flowing with the natural current of existence. A very different vibe from the active social engineering of Confucianism.
And then legalism comes crashing in, sounding completely different from both. Strict laws, harsh punishment. What was their logic?
The legalists, like Han Fei or Shang Yang, looked at the chaos of the warring states and concluded that relying on morality, like Confucius, or nature, like the Taoists, was hopelessly naive. They believed human nature was fundamentally selfish and driven by self-interest. Therefore, the only way to maintain order and strengthen the state was through clear, strict, publicly known laws, say, with predictable, harsh punishments for breaking them and rewards for obeying them.
So forget morality, just enforce the rules.
Pretty much. They emphasize the importance of state power, centralized authority, and techniques, so for the ruler to maintain control over his ministers and populace. Agriculture and military strength were seen as the two pillars of a strong state. Legalism wasn't concerned with individual virtue or cosmic harmony. It was purely pragmatic, focused on results, namely, a rich state and the powerful army capable of unifying China by force. It was an authoritarian, efficient, and ultimately very influential in the short term.
Three incredibly different visions born from the same crisis. It's amazing how that period of fragmentation led to such profound intellectual diversity.
It truly is one of the most remarkable periods in intellectual history anywhere. These schools of thought, along with others, wrestled with the fundamental questions of existence, society, and governance, and their ideas laid the groundwork for much of the subsequent intellectual and political development in China and East Asia. The legacy of the Zhou isn't just political, it's deeply philosophical.
So after all this time, all this conflict, all this thought, how does the Zhou story finally end? How does this dynasty and the feudal system it represented actually meet its demise?
Well, as we mentioned, the Warring States period was a brutal elimination contest, and the state that ultimately emerged victorious, the one that perfected the ruthless efficiency often associated with legalism, was Qin.
Qin, one of the 7 major states.
Exactly. Through a combination of military prowess, strategic alliances, agricultural reforms that boosted its resources, and arguably its adoption of legalist principles that centralized power and mobilized the population effectively, Qin systematically conquered all the other warring states.
And this leads to the famous first emperor, Qin Shi Huang.
Precisely. In 221 BCE, the king of Qin completed the conquest, unifying China under his rule and declaring himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. And one of his very first, most radical acts was to completely abolish the old Zhou feudal system.
No more feudal lords, no more hereditary lands.
Gone. He saw that decentralized system as the root cause of the centuries of division and warfare. He wanted absolute central control. So he stripped the old aristocracy of their power and land. Many noble families were forced to move to the capital, Xianyang, where he could keep an eye on them.
What did he replace the feudal system with?
He established a highly centralized empire. He divided the entire country into administrative units, commanderies, and prefectures run by officials appointed by him based on merit or loyalty, not birthright. These officials reported directly back to the central government. Land was now, in theory, under the control of the emperor and administered through his bureaucracy. It was a complete break from the Zhou model, ending the era of semi-independent regional powers and ushering in the age of imperial China.
So Qin erased the Zhou system, but did the Zhou legacy just disappear entirely?
Not at all. While the political structure of Zhou feudalism was dismantled, its influence lingered in profound ways. The imperial system that followed, starting with Qin and then more enduringly with the Han Dynasty, reshaped Zhou ideas, but didn't completely discard them.
How so? What specific concepts carried over?
Well, the most obvious one is the mandate of heaven, Tianming. Even though Qin Shi Huang relied more on raw power and legalist ideology, subsequent dynasties, especially the Han, picked up the mandate of heaven concept again. It became the standard justification for imperial rule for the next 2,000 years. Every dynasty claimed it ruled because heaven willed it, reinforcing that idea of moral accountability, even if it was often just rhetoric.
Interesting. What else?
Aspects of what you might call feudal morality also persisted. Things like the strong emphasis on hierarchy, the importance of family loyalty, and filial piety ideas heavily promoted by Confucianism, which itself was born from the Zhou era, became deeply embedded in Chinese culture and statecraft. The ideal of the scholar official, educated in the classics, many of which dated back to the Zhou, became central to the imperial bureaucracy. So while the political system changed drastically, many of the social norms, ethical values, and philosophical frameworks born during the Zhou continued to shape China.
So even though the Zhou system itself ultimately failed and led to fragmentation, the ideas and cultural patterns it fostered had this incredible staying power.
Absolutely. It shows how even political systems that collapse can leave behind powerful ideological and cultural legacies. The Zhou era, in its rise, its long reign, its fragmentation, and its intellectual ferment, truly laid foundations, both positive and negative, that influenced the entire subsequent course of Chinese history. Ideas can definitely outlive the specific structures that birthed them.
What a journey we've taken then. From the Zhou overthrowing the Shang, armed with this new mandate of heaven, setting up a feudal system that brought stability for centuries, only for that very system to eventually break down under pressure, leading to centuries of conflict.
A real paradox.
Yeah, but then out of that chaos, out of that fragmentation, comes this incredible explosion of thought, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism ideas that would define Chinese civilization. It really underscores the Zhou dynasty as this absolutely crucial turning point. You can't really understand later Chinese history without grappling with the Zhou.
It really sets the stage for everything that follows.
It really does. It shows how order can breed stability, but maybe how disorder, paradoxically, can breed incredible intellectual growth.
Which leads to a fascinating question to leave our listeners with. If we connect this all to the bigger picture, what does the Zhou dynasty's journey, starting with this divinely sanctioned feudal order, collapsing into chaos, but then producing this profound philosophical awakening from that chaos, what does that tell you about the relationship between political stability and intellectual flourishing?
Hmm.
Is a stable, ordered society always the best incubator for deep thought and innovation? Or can periods of disruption, fragmentation, and crisis sometimes be the very catalyst that force humanity to ask the biggest questions and come up with the most profound insights? Something to think about.